Can pawn breaks create weak squares in the opponent's position? Have you ever wondered how a simple pawn move can change the entire game? Let's take a closer look at the fascinating world of pawn breaks and their impact on weak squares in chess. Pawn breaks are strategic moves where you advance your pawns to disrupt your opponent's structure. This can lead to the creation of weak squares in their position, which can be a game changer. First, let's talk about pawn structure. The way pawns are arranged on the board is crucial. Each pawn controls the squares in front of it. If a square is not covered by a pawn, it becomes weak. This is where pawn breaks come into play. When you execute a pawn break, you can open lines and create weaknesses in your opponent's setup. For example, consider advancing a pawn from the d4 square to the d5 square. This move can leave the d4 square weak if it is not supported by other pawns or pieces. Now, your opponent might find it difficult to defend that square, making it an attractive target for your pieces. Another important aspect is the opening of lines. When you create a pawn break, you can open lines for your rooks and queens. These pieces can then target weak squares along those lines. If your opponent has pawns that are not well supported, those squares can become vulnerable and easy to occupy. Disrupting your opponent's pawn chains is another effective strategy. A well-timed pawn break can break their chain, leaving certain squares undefended. This creates weak squares that you can exploit with your pieces, especially knights and bishops, which thrive on occupying these squares. Now, how can you apply this in your games? Before making a pawn break, think about how it will affect your opponent's pawn structure. Look for chances to create weak squares that your pieces can take advantage of. Use these breaks to open lines for your pieces to develop and attack. On the flip side, be aware of your opponent's potential to create weak squares through their pawn breaks. Plan your own pawn structure to minimize these weaknesses. Always aim to support key squares with your pawns to avoid giving your opponent easy targets. In summary, pawn breaks can indeed create weak squares in your opponent's position. By disrupting their pawn structure and leaving certain squares undefended, you can gain a significant advantage. Understanding how to manage these weaknesses is a vital part of effective chess strategy. So, the next time you consider a pawn break, think about the weak squares it might create for your opponent.